It's in every setting where there are children. Across the socioeconomic spectrum, it pervades our society.
It's so hard for someone to talk about this. It's so painful to have that vulnerability exposed on stage simply because their single action of bravery can change lives is unbelievable.
March 12th, 2011.
Tonight, we are gathered in a theater that was built as a haven for neglected and abused children.
Tonight, we represent some of the children who survived.
We are the triumphant ones.
But there are many more who cannot speak out, either out of fear or out of shame.
Most children who are abused never tell anyone.
So can you guys just quickly grab your script?
Tonight, we honor those who can't speak, and we break the silence for them.
I was silent for 40 years. I was silent for 40 years. You put yourself in a padded cell, no input of any kind, no human touch, that's silence.
Silence around child sexual abuse is about secrecy, or the silence is from shame.
We carry that shame all our lives.
There's something so fundamental about that trauma.
Silence delegitimizes people's reality, and by not talking about something, you're in essence saying that it doesn't exist.
If you're asked not to talk about something so damaging, it can cause so many ripples of hurt.
To just have one person hear you and say, gosh, I'm so sorry this happened to you. It is not your fault. This is all of our faults that we let this happen. And I think for someone to have just that one interaction.
In the process of doing this play, I learned that both my parents are survivors of sexual violence. I never knew. I realized how being a survivor has permeated my life in so many ways. It will always be there.
I think the building block of this work is storytelling and creating space for survivors to tell their stories.
The abuse continues. My brother finds ways to hold power over me. I am closed in by shame on all sides.
This was specifically about being a survivor of child sexual assault. And all of us were sharing different stories, but the same topic.
My family never talks about what happened to me. Maybe they think I'm fine, but when I close my eyes, I still feel
hands, breath, fear, shame.
I'm 8 years old.
On a community level, there aren't ways to really talk about what happens when this kind of trauma happens at such a young age.
I am still healing.
I am still healing.
I am still healing.
I am still healing.
As a child, there was the fear that I would be made fun of. I would be blamed for it. I'd be isolated in some way. To share these stories in front of audiences and have them not do any of those things is really reassuring and really healing.
People want us to talk about this if we can, and I can, so I do.
I decided to come to this show because I am a survivor and because I've been silent for so long.
Just witnessing the stories that people have to tell is so healing.
When you hear 5 stories interwoven and their complexities are all lined up for you right there in one show, it's very hard to start saying, no, I couldn't be in that situation. Nobody I know could be in any of those 5 situations, because you know they could.
There's a teenage boy who comes to the house. His name is Jay. I don't remember how many times Jay abused me. I do remember the day I stopped it from happening. This is actually the notebook I used to do the writing that we did for Secret Survivors. We would get different prompts, laid out all kinds of memories, gave our journals to Sarah, the writer and the director, and it became part of the material that she used to build the story. We started out with easier things, I think, or things that weren't directly about child sexual abuse. Here's a memory of when someone called me a liar. I guess I decided not to answer that question, I think. So much is left out of Secret Survivors, but that's kind of the point. It's simply about opening up a space to talk about being a survivor of child sexual abuse, being active in trying to change the world. It's a starting point.
What if the person hurting you is the person you're supposed to trust?
Who do you tell then?
90% of the time, children know who their abusers are. And we don't give them the language, the understanding, we don't give them the tools, and we really don't accept it. That's a harder conversation for us to have.
Most victims, because of the messages they get in our culture, have some level of self-doubt, self-blame, shame around their experience.
In my family, we don't talk about sex at all. So to talk about abuse, we don't have the language or the comfort to kind of go there.
This remains one issue where people very quickly go into denial, are unable to figure out how to respond, and want to distance themselves from this.
These are the names.
These are the names.
These are the names.
These are the names.
These are the names of people who hurt.
No matter what our tradition or affiliation, we can agree that the sexual abuse of a child is a terrible abuse of power.
The first place that the most vulnerable members of our community are learning about power and control, silence, shame and blame, how to collude with violence, what it means to have power over somebody, what it means to submit.
It's so much easier to pretend it doesn't happen in our society, in our community, within our culture.
It's easier to deal with a death than it is to, I think, deal with child sexual abuse in a Native community. Because it's not supposed to happen in a Native community, but it does. When something's distorted, like with child sexual abuse, it can create some chaos. When you're living in two different worlds, the westernized world and the Native American culture, it makes it that much more complicated. Looking at history as a damaging piece. During the time when we were thriving, missionaries came and they stripped the children away from their parents, away from their communities to take away their identity as Native people. We hear stories, horror stories of how they were physically abused, at other times sexually abused, generation after generation after generation of abuse. So much hurt and so much pain over the years. To hear those stories and I guess being able to relate myself, as a survivor. If I don't talk about it, others may feel that it's not okay to talk about. Well, I'm here to say today that it is. It's the only way healing begins.
What do you think of when you hear the word survivor?
Warriors.
Someone who made it.
More than a victim.
Every day is a different answer.
Surviving is not the end point.
Surviving is only the beginning.
One of the things I loved about Secret Survivors was that it started with a generational frame to it, and it began with people talking about their great-grandfather, their mothers, their grandparents.
Winnie McDonald is 6 years old. She and her 8 siblings are sent to a Catholic state home. For 12 years, she endures sexual, emotional, and physical abuse at the hands of Catholic nuns. The trauma of this
will reverberate down her life.
And mine. She will become my biological mother.
We know that violence is passed down from generation to generation, that violence is learned, and violence becomes a normalized part, has become a normalized part of so many of our lives and so many of our families and legacies.
When you have generational perpetration, it's so complicated because the impact of the traumas, it just cascades.
A young boy named Vashisht is sexually abused by neighborhood boys and servants.
There is no intervention.
There is also a family rumor that his much older brother molests little boys.
There is no intervention.
These family secrets will haunt my whole life. He will become my father.
1967.
Queens, New York.
There was violence in my life for 16 years. My mother stayed with my father and never told her mother what was going on. My extended family didn't know. Basically, the pressure was on for us to keep up appearances. Even after I tried to tell the truth, there was a lot of pressure to still keep living a lie. As a kid, I always wanted the violence in my own life to stop, and I couldn't. I was never able to be successful in that. And I think that experience really planted the seeds for the work I'm doing now.
Well, thank you for having me here and bringing me in to share my work with you. I actually have spent the past 10 years working in New York City high schools with young people like yourself, talking about social justice and human rights issues. You name it, we talked about it, but we almost never talked about child sexual abuse. So take a guess, just to think beyond just us in this room as survivors, right? How often do you think child sexual abuse happens?
So I think it's probably 3 out of 10 or something like that.
Okay.
1 in 20 for boys.
1 in 20 for boys?
Mostly girls.
Mostly girls? 1 in 4 girls? 1 in 6 boys. So not that different between boys and girls.
Is it 25% people that reported it?
Yeah.
Oh, then, okay, I believe that, but
it might be higher.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. It sometimes can take us a long time to tell people, this happened to me, because there's an issue of whether someone will believe you. And there's also the issue of will people make you feel ashamed?
I'm 13 years old. My father stopped raping me just before I turned 12. Maybe he was afraid I would get pregnant. Now I'm scared for my little sister. I decide to tell my mother about the years of sexual abuse. She calls a therapist to get help and confronts my father. My father's physical and verbal violence towards all of us increases. We are terrified, afraid to stay, and afraid to leave.
In a lot of homes where there was domestic violence and spousal abuse, there was also intimate violence, there was also child abuse and neglect. The systems are not set up to protect mothers or children.
He is sentenced to 5 years probation with no jail time. My mother decides to stay with him, and we're all still living in the same home. It is extremely unsafe.
The survivor's voice is nowhere in this picture. And all that happens is this child living in this traumatic situation No community accountability, no healing resources, the perpetrator with no possibility for transformation. I mean, there is no way I can't describe this as a complete disaster.
Immediately, the family loses control of the situation. So there isn't room to prepare for this big upheaval that's going to happen.
The damage isn't just for the victim. The damage is for everybody around him, too. It's for mom and dad, it's for wife, it's for kids, it's for grandkids, it's for cousins.
My sister and I spend every summer with our grandmother, our Nani. Visiting her is the only time I feel safe from my father. Still, I'm scared of darkness and shadows, weighed down by secrets. At night, Nani sings me to sleep with a Hindi lullaby. Dire, dire,
That was one of such beautiful songs that I had chosen to sing to you. And often I sang that to you when putting you to sleep, when you were a baby. And please imagine that you are a bulbul, which is a singing bird.
Nightingale, right?
Yes,
Aww.
that's what that song is about.
Well, I always got the best sleep at your house, so.
Yeah, and those were the best experiences, putting you to sleep. Yeah, so.
You, at that time, were a social worker. You were working with kids who were going through family violence. And I just can't imagine what it was like for you. I would love to hear that,
I kept researching. I said, what is it that I have missed, that I did not detect? And I never knew the facts at all. The things that are presented to you are fictions. So this is ongoing. And I think I'm doing it even today. In every case, it has to be a fight. Without a fight, you don't seem to be able to achieve because it is so complex. On personal level, my healing in relation to my trauma with what has happened to you, it is a trauma for me too. Of course. And way back in 2000, you had sent an email to me. My response to you was, I suffer in your suffering, and I will heal in your healing. That was my feeling in 2000. That's my feeling today.
Love you, Nani.
Justice means getting the truth out and bellowing it from the rafters.
Justice to me means truth-telling and validating other people's experiences.
I think justice means to me, when I think about it, connected to my individual experience, that it would look like that never having to happen to another disabled child ever again. And
I think justice is different for every victim and survivor. And for me, it was part of my healing process.
Healing doesn't come with prosecution, with justice in the criminal sense of what justice is known as, but when you bear witness is when healing starts.
Di,
Yes, RJ.
what do you think of when you hear the word justice?
It should mean fairness, dignity, forgiveness, and transformation. Unfortunately, in our society, the idea of justice has been corrupted by entitlement, greed, and power. I saw both outcomes of the justice system in my case of child abuse.
I was 3 when I started going to daycare. By the time I was 4, it came out that there were allegations of child sexual abuse against my teacher. Ultimately, my teacher was convicted of hundreds of counts of child sexual abuse, given a really long prison sentence, granted an appeal based on a technicality. Walked out of prison a free woman.
1985,
New Jersey.
My parents find out that my daycare teacher has resigned and is being investigated for child abuse.
Well, I think many of us like to think that the criminal justice system sets things straight, makes them right, balances things out, but it doesn't because the damage is already done. It seemed to me that the evidence, at least the part of it that I had seen, was so overwhelming. Although I knew the testimony of children was going to be problematic in trying to get a conviction, that it was overturned. You know, things happen in the criminal justice system that don't seem right, but they're consistent with the way we apply our laws.
And you're an officer of the court saying
I am an officer of the court. It's very painful. But you had that one conversation with the investigators where you disclosed information about what happened. And it was a very short time after that you closed, she just closed down. You were not remembering anything.
My memory is different from the other cast members because my response to my traumatic experiences was to dissociate and forget. This used to be the daycare that I went to. I have not been here in 27 years. I have to see it. I had just disconnected any feelings that I had towards this place, but several dozen kids were abused here. 1984, 1985. And I was one of those kids, actually. In the community, people responded very similarly to how I responded, which is that I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to feel it. I didn't want it to affect my life. It affects me deeply. We're so prevented by our culture from dealing with this issue. We're just scared of it.
Having been abused as a teenager by my minister when I was about 15 and never facing it, never admitting it, never sharing it with anyone until age 56, people look at you and they think you're like everybody else. And you go through life, and I got married when I was 20, and I had kids, and I had jobs. But inside, this is what's going on. Nothing makes sense. It's chaos. How do you make sense of things when something as basic as a relationship between a child and a minister or a parent and child are broken? Things that connect up in most people's brains disconnect. So that's my picture. I was silent for 40 years. I was silent for 40 years. It was the trigger that opened up that door. It broke through my defenses. My daughter, she called me in the middle of the night. Her oldest son had thrown a tantrum. He was about 10 years old. I went over to the house to go find him. I went in his bedroom and I opened a closet door. He was standing absolutely rigid, white as a sheet. Seeing a vulnerable child, not knowing what was going to happen to him, that was an image that was seared in my mind, obviously, because I was that boy. Just in the last 2 years is the only time that I've first started talking about it. And now you can't shut me up. And my wife says, put it down, Randy, put it down. Do you have to deal with abuse all the time? And I kind of do. When I actually faced the abuse and the fact that I had been a victim, all the distortions of my life, the lack of relationships, the alcohol and drug, all of these things at their core was this abuse.
2005. I find a list of common characteristics of survivors.
Numbing pain with drugs or alcohol.
A need to please, to always be the giver.
Fear of intimacy.
Problems with personal boundaries.
Memory problems.
A crippling need to be perfect.
Never truly feeling safe.
Distrusting people.
Over-trusting people.
I recognize myself in that list.
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 Most men don't have the language to be able to work through and talk about their situation, their truth, their recovery. Culturally, we automatically go to sexual abuse of boys being an issue of clergy or the Boy Scouts. The reality is that clergy abuse is right at about 5% of the total problem. That leaves 95% of the problem being neighbors and family members.
There's a teenage boy who comes to the house. He is friends with my babysitter's son. I never told my parents about the abuse I experienced. Sometimes, I'm afraid people will make assumptions about me if they know I was abused.
Both the general community and survivors have a number of perceptions that are not necessarily truthful. If you're abused by a man, does that make you gay? Were you, or because you were gay, is that why you were abused?
Figuring out where I fit in has always been the name of the game. My first year of college, I played with the idea of being bisexual. That lasts about a week. Whether it's about gender, whether it's about sexuality, I think it does impact how you develop your sexuality, not whether or not you're queer or not.
I tell someone I know about my experience of abuse. I'm shocked when she says,
"Oh, do you think that's why you're gay?"
And I want to say,
No. If everyone who was sexually abused as a child turned out to be gay, the whole world would be gay.
For most of us, the power differential is so great that you don't think that saying stop is an option. So, and yet a lot of abuse comes peer to peer. You know, comes from an older child. What do they say? 40%, something like that. It's pretty high numbers. And to even know or teach our kids that they can say stop, that's huge.
I don't remember how many times Jay abused me. I do remember the day I stopped it from happening. We are alone in an empty room. I know what he wants me to do, but I stay away from him.
I've been through different things in my life, and pretty much everything I shared with my mother, even if I didn't share it with anyone else, that I would keep it from the person that I had been closest to in my life, to keep it to myself. That was another indicator for me about how difficult those experiences have been.
I go home to Cincinnati to see my mother. We often take walks together to talk and catch up. I tell her about my abuse for the first time. She cries, and I cry. She asks me questions about my well-being. She supports me and encourages me in my path to healing.
There's Jay, actually right there.
You're kidding me. One of the things that I thought of when you told me was that, you know, then it reminded me of when I was young and it happened with a neighbor boy. Why does it happen to so many people? Even though I'd experienced that, it didn't dawn on me that you would. How do you feel now, talking about it?
I don't think I knew that happened to you.
You didn't? I thought I told you that morning when you told me.
You alluded to it. You didn't tell me exactly.
I wish just once my mother would have said these words to me.
Gabby, we love you and we will always love you. I'm sorry that Stevie abused you. It's so sad to know a son is capable of doing something that horrible to anyone, let alone his own sister. We wish we could have protected you. None of this was your fault.
Time did not wait for me to figure out things about those years.
I wrote that song for my mother, who raised me.
Head up high, I learned to laugh through tears, yeah.
My mother did the very best she could. She adopted me. I had a roof over my head. I had food to eat. My brother, he was given this place in the family as an honorable son. He went to church on Sundays. When I was a teenager, I told my mom, I said, you know, that he's been molesting me, he's been touching me and all of this for years.
Slow goodbyes.
She said I was lying. She didn't believe me. I didn't speak to her for many years. I didn't talk to her, and she died. And that song was a completion for me to reflect upon my life. So when I asked the question, do you still love me? It was for her. Do you still love me? Now that you're on the other side.
In order to be able to begin speaking about my trauma, I was advised by my therapist to try to put into words what I was actually experiencing at the moment of my trauma, when it first began. So I wrote this poem called Darkness Consumes the Light. And so I'm gonna read Darkness Consumes the Light. Out of a blissful deep slumber, I am stirred. Visions of toys and childish things now blurred. Through wispy, sleepy, innocent eyes, I see a grown naked man standing in front of me. As I wipe hours of caked sleep now mingle with warm tears once dry, I start to question why. A childhood erased in the blink of an eye. Questions as I feel despair begin to arise. Is this a dream? But my eyes don't lie. And still I ponder why. Just call out, my soul shouts in vain. Open your mouth and tell of this thing. The harder I try, much to my chagrin, the voice stays silent within. My aunt married this man, brought him into the family. We lived in a very small apartment in the Bronx. He sexually abused me when I was 9 or 10 years old. In my heart, I felt like this was really wrong, but I was young. He woke me up and took me to the bathroom, and I heard this noise, and in my mind, I'm thinking someone is coming, and that noise quickly subsided, just like my hope subsided. That hope was that someone was gonna come and save me, and it never happened. When I was 11, we were in the living room, I had my head on his lap. My uncle came in and said, what the hell is going on here? I mean, he used more, rougher words, but he's like, what the fuck is this? What's going on here? Why is my nephew laying on this guy's lap? And my grandmother kept saying, oh no, that's like his father, in a little Spanish accent. No, that's like his father, it's nothing. And my uncle ran on for about 15 to 20 minutes. And he was just like, what the fuck is going on? And my grandmother just kept pushing it to the side. And he eventually let it go. But he was not happy about it. I could tell he was angry and he knew something was going on, but he just couldn't put his finger on it. And so I had a meeting with him recently, and I kind of told him what happened. On my path to healing, I'm very vocal about my trauma, and I'm telling my family about it, whether they like it or not. And so I told my uncle about this trauma, this period in time, not only about my trauma, but the period in time that I recall him speaking up, and I thanked him. And we're both in this restaurant crying because I thanked him because he was the only one that actually even ever said anything. He felt it. He might not have pursued it because my grandmother was very powerful and persuasive. And she had this way of once it was over, it was over. But I remember he went on for about 20 minutes, and I thanked him because he was the only one that actually knew something was happening, and he didn't know what it was, but at least he said something. And I thanked him very much for that. And it just hurt. And he actually revealed to me that he had trauma growing up as well. And so it's a vicious cycle. It's so insidious and it's so ugly, and there's so much of it going on. A lot of it we don't know about. And so again, the reason that I'm here is to try to get this out.
For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive.
And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning.
When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return.
And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid.
So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive.
If indeed 25% of the population were sexually abused as children, our audience, who we'd like to communicate with, a very large portion of them might have suffered this particular situation, and we need to be sensitive to that.
To be able to portray survivors in ways that support people who are not that far along. See, you know, I can heal. I can talk about this.
The hope is that we can do that in relationship with each other and in community with each other.
I'd love to see a national coming out day where people that have survived this can stand together arm in arm and say, I am a survivor and I'm not alone.
What I do with my story and what I do with my life now is what matters, which is why I do things like this, because it's important for me to have control over my experience.
Some people end up writing letters to their abusers and saying, you know, I don't own this anymore, it's yours. You know, because the thing that happens during the abuse act is that the person thinks that it's his or her fault. And then to give that back to the person who abused is very powerful, very empowering.
There are a lot more people at the table now than there used to be. When you want to talk about keeping kids safe and preventing child sexual abuse, I think it's been a conversation that people have been having behind closed doors for a long time.
There are lots of ways where we've been able to open up those conversations and start to have dialogue with communities who really were only talking about child sexual abuse, you know, in whispers.
It's starting to happen all over the place. I mean, people are starting to realize that, you know, that we have to have a vision of liberation and social justice that really encompasses personal healing with transformation. Across this country, the idea of collective transformation and collective voice is beginning to gather momentum. Alternatives to systemic responses recognized as a legitimate way to go. Just as this show, the Secret Survivor show, it's something that people can hold on to as a source of hope.
Sometimes I